Hello and welcome to a brand new Mind Mastery video. Today I'm going to talk about the shadow and what sort of things we can do, what sort of actions we can take in order to integrate the shadow into our whole personality, and obviously how can we stop this shadow from influencing ourselves, our behaviors, our feelings and reactions to various things on a regular basis, which happens when we are not aware of our own shadows. So in general, discovering our shadow is like pulling a thread. So we start from one issue that is closest to our consciousness, something that could be related to an aspect of our personality which we don't accept, or which we are ashamed of, or which we are scared of. And the more we inquire into this one idea, or this one particular behavior, or a thought, or a feeling, or something like a recurring pattern that we experience in our life, the more we inquire into it, the more we can discover. That's in general. And obviously I'm going to be using a lot of general ideas because ultimately the journey of shadow integration is a very personal one. It's very unique to every individual, and there is no, universal receipt or universal instructions that can help every individual person to integrate this shadow, because every single person is different and every single person has a different shadow, different manifestations of the shadow, simply because the shadow itself is based on personal unconscious, which is obviously coming from, or is rather developed through our past experiences. So obviously that's very personal, very unique and very individual, and we can't simply find a receipt that will work for each and every individual. Anyway, so to start with, in general, the shadow itself is this rejected or denied part of our personality, of our mind, that we don't identify with, or we don't want to have, or we don't want to deal with, simply because it's in conflict with our conscious values, demands from the environment, expectations from other people, and what we believe is the right thing to do. So in a general sense, shadow could be manifested as something that's conflicted with what we believe is the right way to live, or is the right way to be. I'm going to be using lots of descriptions of symbols, because obviously the unconscious itself doesn't speak the common language, if you like. It doesn't speak the language that we understand and use in everyday life, but it uses these various symbols and connections between various ideas in order to manifest itself. So, for example, the shadow itself could be thought of as Lucifer, who rebelled in heaven and who was banished from the heaven when the God found out that he doesn't want to comply with what God asked him to do and on all these values. So shadow can be compared to this mechanism or to this pattern where we banish certain aspects of ourselves to the unconscious, away from what we believe is the right way. And as a consequence, there could be several mechanisms in action which might be coming off as drives or impulses to do certain things, to react in certain ways that are familiar to us, which we can't fully control. To explain it further, we could also think about the shadow as a being that doesn't really have a face. I mean, the shadow itself, in a general sense, in what we imagine the shadow to be, doesn't have a face. It's simply a representation of something like a void that doesn't have a particular shape, and it can't be fully manifested. However, we can still perceive it. So because the shadow doesn't have a face, it's going to strive to have this face in order to be manifested in the external world. So one of the mechanisms that it's going to use is to simply overpower the ego in order to get that face in the form of our persona. So that might happen in situations where we react automatically to certain events or people in our lives, Or in extreme scenarios, it can happen when we simply become, by psychoanalytical terms, possessed by our shadow, where our ego loses control and we simply act under the influence of these various drives that come from the shadow itself. So, for example, depending on a person, but such an individual might become very aggressive, angry, impulsive, and generally doing things that are in conflict with what that individual believes is right. If that option is not possible for the shadow, the option of taking up that phase, the shadow itself is going to use other people as a mean of manifesting itself, of having this phase in order to be recognized in the world. And this possibility is probably much more common because it doesn't involve an action where the ego loses control and is being overpowered by the shadow itself. And this process, if you like, of using other people for the shadow's phase is simply called the projection. This projective mechanism is not necessarily bad for you because it provides you with a way of learning more about your own shadow. If you can't recognize the shadow in yourself, perhaps you can learn about it by recognizing it in other people, which obviously is a positive process because first of all, you'll learn about your shadow, and second of all, you learn that you are projecting stuff onto other people, and therefore you're not seeing people for who they are. So I think it's a very valuable learning experience once you recognize it. So these are the common manifestations of the shadow in ourselves and in other people. But how can we truly recognize it? How can we know whether what we see or what we feel is coming from the shadow? Well, obviously, it comes down to being mindful of yourself, of your behaviors, and questioning your reactions, questioning your feelings, questioning why you're reacting in particular ways, why you don't like that particular individual, what is it that annoys you so much about yourself, about other people, and probably what is it that makes you feel perhaps ashamed or even anxious about human behavior in general. So being mindful about these various patterns that you can observe, and obviously being able to stay in the moment and catch yourself whilst reacting to someone, whilst reacting to a particular experience, is obviously quite necessary step towards understanding your own shadow and being able to know where your reactions are coming from, where your feelings are coming from, and are these really authentic feelings, or are they coming from a place of a shadow which is simply based on this outdated beliefs, outdated attitude to the world, and outdated interpretations of your experience. So obviously you can't really integrate your shadow if you don't know anything about it. So learning about the shadow is a crucial step, and I think it's, once you do that, it's at least 80% work done of the shadow integration, because having this awareness gives you a choice, a power onto whether you want to follow these automatic reactions of the shadow, and or whether you want to do something different, whether you want to say, no, I'm not gonna continue with being this angry individual, or I'm not going to continue with being narcissistic, and so on and forth. So again, it all depends on what your shadow is. What are your weaknesses? What are your inferiorities that you're trying to hide from the world? That's where your shadow basically lies. And again, this knowledge comes from, first of all, mindfulness, and second of all, a kind of investigating these particular issues that kind of stand out from this background, or are on this conscious background, or are, drifting in your consciousness once in a while, something that's reoccurring over and over again in your life. That could be a good point of learning about your shadow. And also perhaps you will be as lucky as I am to meet kind individuals who are going to point out certain things to you, which might occur unconsciously, which you might not realize or not see within yourself, but which can be perceived by other people. So there are obviously many different sources of knowledge. Now, what do we do with that knowledge? Obviously, having this awareness of the shadow is much better than not having any, but generally this journey never ends. It's like you pull this thread, you pull it, you pull it, you pull it, and nothing really comes out. It doesn't end. Because that's the nature of the unconscious, and that's the nature of the shadow itself. You will always cast a shadow. Like all objects in the universe cast a shadow. Ego casts a shadow, and your whole self casts a shadow as well. And obviously this thread leads into, really deep parts of your psyche. But to come back to the integration. So basically, to answer this question of what is it that we should do with this knowledge about the shadow? Well, that was a dilemma I've been struggling with for quite some time, really. And probably that's one of the reasons why I didn't make a video on the shadow, which I should have done ages ago, probably. But it truly is a dilemma because, okay, you know what your shadow is, but what do you do with it? Do you banish it to the unconscious? Do you just do what God did with Lucifer? Learn about it, banish it to the unconscious and forget about it. I'm not sure if that's the best solution, because then you basically allow the shadow to run wild again and do whatever it wants to do. So obviously you need a method which will allow you to pay attention to it. Just as the saying goes that, keep your friends close, but your enemies even closer. And I think that approach is applicable to the shadow itself. An alternative perspective which we could embrace here is that the shadow is not all evil. It's not a source of all the bad behaviors, all the wrong actions that you might take, all the wrong feelings, all the terrifying drives that represent the humanity as a whole. But it also contains these elements which might serve you well in certain situations. For example, a drive to protect yourself, a drive to, strive towards getting what you want, or strive towards fairness and justice. If you learn how to use this shadow potential, this energy, into serving you. So, in other words, it could be compared to, slaying a dragon, slaying a wild animal that has all these negative qualities, but if used properly, if kind of molded into something that you want it to be, and that can be used towards getting what you want, getting what you need, then obviously we can apply this pattern to the shadow itself, because shadow in general is just a bunch of energy, a bunch of drives and motivations and intentions that can be used to a very valuable, which can be used as a very valuable tool on your path of development in general and living in the world. So I think that in this case you need an attitude of being fairly humble, because if you start from a place of being very confident and inflexible and rigid, you're not going to be able to assimilate the knowledge from the unconscious, because you're going to block it out. You're going to dismiss it as something that doesn't fit your self-definition or interpretation of the world. So you need to be humble enough to kind of understand that, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm not as capable as I thought I am. Maybe I'm not as competent. Maybe I'm not as skilled. Maybe I'm not so great. Maybe I'm not in control in general. Maybe I'm not the master of my own mind, because if you consider all these unconscious drives, then it's very hard not to be humble in the face of this powerful drives that reside in each person in general. So this attitude of being humble towards yourself and towards other people will allow the shadow itself to come out, basically, to manifest itself a bit more. But obviously you don't want to overdo it, because you don't want the shadow itself to overpower you. So you need to be strong enough to say, no, I'm not going to go along with these reactions. I'm not going to go along with this angry attitude or aggressive attitude. I'm not going to go along with, this impulse to hurt someone, for example, or to be nasty and shut off our empathy. Again, it depends on what your shadow wants you to do and what sort of drives it has. So obviously you need to be also strong enough to maintain your ego coherence and self-coherence, where you don't allow the shadow to, overpower you, because you are still in control. Despite being humble, you are still in control, and you are still, responsible for yourself. You still have responsibilities in the external world, and so on and so forth. So being able to balance this both drives to, be humble, but at the same time be very strong, I think it's a basis of shadow integration and generally exploring our unconscious. Otherwise, nothing will be able to come out, and you won't be able to, for example, look at your shadow without identifying with it. Because obviously you don't want to end up in a place where you say, okay, I discover all these fantastic and powerful drives that come from the shadow, but at the same time, it's not you. And you have to realize that, okay, it might belong to you if you want to, but it doesn't define you, because the moment you identify with a shadow, you allow it to take control. And obviously that can have quite unforeseen and unpredictable consequences for your future and for your life in general. And as a last point, I think that this shadow integration is fundamentally based as a choice. So the more you become aware of your shadow, the more you're going to realize that you have a choice. You can go along with certain reactions, automatic reactions or aggressive reactions, or you can say, no, okay, that's a possibility. That might be a valuable insight, but doesn't mean you have to react automatically. A very simple example here would be an individual gets offended, and if they have not integrated their shadow, they might react automatically. For example, they might get very defensive, they might attack the other individual, they might, be very resentful or spiteful towards them. So basically they're gonna react automatically, they're gonna go along with this aggressive impulse that comes from the shadow. Whereas if we look at the individual who has integrated the shadow into their conscious personality, if you like, or at least is aware enough to have a choice, they're going to stop and kind of reflect on their reaction. They're going to think, okay, here I have a choice. I'm getting angry for being offended, for getting offended. That individual obviously said some nasty things towards me. So, okay, I have a right to be angry, which basically gives you an insight into your own reactions, into your own feelings, and where they are coming from. But it doesn't mean I have to act upon these impulses to, hurt the other person back. But I have a choice. I can simply acknowledge my anger. I know where it's coming from. I know why it got triggered. But it doesn't mean I have to react automatically as someone with no awareness and no insight into the shadow would react. And the last point I wanted to make is that the more you investigate your shadow, the bigger your chances are for discovering your anima or animus, because our psyche is not entirely, there are not clear boundaries between certain parts of our mind, but rather, for example, the shadow and the anima or animus, they blend in a way. So once you're able to inquire into your own shadow and your own unconscious mind, you are bound to encounter your anima and animus, which might be represented by your shadow to some extent, although not fully. They might only represent this negative aspects of your anima and animus. So if that happens, your shadow might take a specific gender role, for example. It might become more masculine or more feminine. And if that's the case, we know that there are some differences between how masculine aggressiveness, for example, is manifested and how feminine aggressiveness is manifested, right? And once that happens, you might realize that, this journey never ends, because even if you did manage to deal with your personal unconscious, you are still still on that quest of discovering more about yourself, which lies far deeper in your mind than your personal unconscious. So that's something to consider as well. So I think I shared everything I could share on this subject, at least for now. As I've said before, there is no magic formula that works for each and every individual. So I was trying to make this video as objective as I could. However, to fully know your shadow, to fully investigate this strange part of your mind, if you like, is to simply engage in this self-inquiry process, because no other person, no psychologist, no therapist can know what your shadow is without you fully engaging in this process, without you fully investigating and inquiring into your personal unconscious. Obviously, some people can be helpful. Obviously, some people can give you clues that, perhaps to doing certain things out of unconscious motivations, which can give you a hint onto what your unconscious motivations are. And this will also provide you with some clues onto what your personal shadow is. So I hope that helps. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them just below the video. And if you're interested in learning more about your shadow, I offer personal life coaching, so don't hesitate to send me a private message. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.